Why are women always unhappy? The truth no one tells you. Psychology tips. We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit, often attributed to Aristotle, and the same is true for resentment, criticism, and dissatisfaction. If it becomes a habit, it feels like the truth. Listen, most men misunderstand what they're seeing when a woman seems never satisfied. They take every complaint personally. They scramble to fix it. They apologize, overcorrect, try harder, and slowly end up exhausted, confused, and walking on eggshells. And here's the part no one says plainly: a lot of female unhappiness in relationships isn't actually about the man's latest mistake. It's about a pattern, an inner lens, through which everything gets judged. That lens can come from early life experiences, feeling unsafe, unseen, or having love tied to performance. Social conditioning, the constant message that you deserve more, and settling is failure, stress, and emotional overload, mental load, invisible labor, chronic fatigue, and yes, sometimes a personality habit of focusing on what's missing rather than what's working. So when she says, "You never do anything right," what she often means is, "I don't feel secure, I don't feel understood, I don't feel valued, so my mind is scanning for evidence that confirms it." That's why it can look like this. You bring flowers, wrong kind. You plan a date, wrong place. You help around the house, wrong way. You don't help, you're selfish. You work hard, you're absent. You relax at home, you have no ambition. A man hears those contradictions and thinks, if I can just find the right move, peace will return. But if the lens is the problem, no move will ever be right for long because the goalpost keeps moving. Many men end up saying the same painful sentence: "Nothing I do is ever good enough." And here's the truth that changes everything: it's not always about your actions, it's about the emotional story behind them. If someone carries a deep, unresolved belief like men disappoint, love fades. If I don't complain, I'll be ignored. If I don't control things, I'm not safe. Then even good moments can feel suspicious, and even sincere effort can feel insufficient. That doesn't mean you're off the hook. It means you stop playing a rigged game where you're trying to win approval from a mindset that's trained to find flaws. What happens next in relationships and why it repeats? A lot of men notice a cycle: honeymoon, closeness, routine, criticism increases. Not because you suddenly became terrible, but because routine triggers reality. And reality triggers whatever unresolved expectations, fears, or dissatisfaction she already carried. So the same man can try three different styles: be more romantic, be more strong and decisive, be more considerate and accommodating, and still get hit with not enough. Because the target wasn't your behavior, it was her internal tension looking for an outlet. The real takeaway for men: this isn't about blaming women. It's about stopping the self-destruction men fall into when they think they can perform someone into peace. If you want a relationship to improve, you don't chase endless fixes. You do two things: get clear on what's actually being asked. Not the complaint on the surface, what's underneath it. Set a healthy standard for communication. Criticism without clarity is poison. Requests with respect are workable. Let's break down. Next part: direction. In the next section, you can go deeper into why some women use criticism as a control tool when anxious, how men accidentally reward complaining by over-apologizing, and the exact phrases that turn conflict into clarity without becoming cold or defensive. Let's begin. Let's start at the uncomfortable place most people avoid, because truth rarely arrives wrapped in comfort. The first layer is biology, not blame. Research in psychology shows that roughly half of our personality tendencies are inherited, including how easily someone leans toward optimism or slides into dissatisfaction. Some women are born with nervous systems that scan for problems the way smoke detectors scan for heat. Always alert, always vigilant, always noticing what's missing instead of what's working. Over time, that wiring becomes a default setting where contentment feels unfamiliar and complaint feels normal. Not because they want to be unhappy, not because they enjoy it, but because their internal baseline was tuned that way long before adult choices ever entered the picture. Unless there is deliberate effort to question those thought patterns, challenge them, and slowly replace them, dissatisfaction follows everywhere. From relationship to relationship, from house to house, from paycheck to paycheck. I've seen this repeat through families like a familiar song passed down by ear. Grandmother unhappy, mother unhappy, daughter unhappy. Each convinced her situation is different, yet each reacting to life in nearly the same way. Able to receive love, security, even good fortune, and still feel restless inside. Genetics may lay the foundation, but childhood programming pours the concrete. This is where things become quietly powerful. Again and again, the pattern traces back to two early experiences that shape expectations long before adulthood arrives. The first is a strained or painful relationship with a father figure, maybe through absence, maybe emotional distance, maybe unpredictability. The lesson absorbed isn't logical, it's emotional, a silent conclusion that men disappoint. That closeness leads to letdown. That trust is risky. She grows up carrying that belief like invisible luggage, choosing partners who confirm it or placing impossible emotional demands on decent men until disappointment becomes inevitable. Not because those men lack effort, but because no one can outperform an unhealed wound. The second scenario is quieter, but just as influential. Watching a mother who is never satisfied, always scanning for what should be different, better, or more. Modeling that dissatisfaction is simply how womanhood works, how marriage works, how life works. Children don't analyze this. They absorb it. Tone, atmosphere, emotional rhythm. By adulthood, the daughter isn't copying her mother consciously. She's running the same emotional software automatically, catching herself repeating the same phrases, the same frustrations, the same restless hunger, even if she once promised herself she'd never live that way. Familiarity is seductive, and without awareness, people choose what feels known over what feels peaceful. Then comes the modern accelerant that turns dissatisfaction into a constant hum, the expectation gap. Today's culture sells a glossy fantasy about relationships that no human can maintain long term. Built on movies, highlight reels, filtered moments. Love is supposed to feel exciting, validating, and effortless. Reality delivers bills, routines, misunderstandings, fatigue, ordinary flaws. When fantasy collides with reality, frustration rushes in, not because reality is broken, but because expectations were never grounded. I once knew a woman, let's call her Anna, intelligent, attractive, capable. She married a man who treated her with consistency and care. Within months, she felt empty, not because he failed, but because she expected marriage to repair old wounds, fill emotional gaps, and finally make her feel whole. When that didn't happen, she didn't question the expectation. She questioned the man. This is where projection takes over. If only he earned more. If only he changed this. If only we upgraded that. Each improvement brought brief relief, followed by the same hollow feeling. The target keeps moving when dissatisfaction isn't actually about the target at all. Here is the instruction psychology tips often soften, but must say clearly, don't expect a relationship to fix what self-awareness has ignored. Be honest about where fulfillment actually comes from. That is the work no partner can do for you. Comparison now pours fuel on this fire like never before. Social media offers endless windows into curated lives. Gifts, trips, bodies, milestones. The brain was never designed to process that volume without distortion. So comparison becomes constant, always highlighting what she lacks, rarely what she has. This is where love advice and dating tips often mislead men. They suggest you can outgive or outperform dissatisfaction. You can't. You can only participate in it or step back from it. The deeper truth is this: dissatisfaction is rarely cured by better circumstances. It is eased by awareness, boundaries, and realistic expectations. Men need to hear this clearly. Not to judge women, not to dismiss them, but to stop personalizing patterns formed long before they arrived. Compassion without clarity leads to exhaustion. Clarity without compassion leads to bitterness. So here is the grounded takeaway, drawn from real psychology tips that actually work. Don't try to rescue. Be grounded. That is attractive. You must recognize the difference between someone committed to growth and someone committed to complaint. Don't confuse effort with progress. Be attentive, but don't disappear. Be generous, but don't overextend. Balance matters more than grand gestures ever will. If you want love advice and dating tips that protect your peace, remember this: happiness is an inside job first. Relationships amplify what already exists, they don't replace it. And the men who thrive in love later in life learn this early: not to harden their hearts, but to choose wisely, love steadily, and walk away when necessary, without anger, without blame, and without losing themselves in the process. At the end of all this analysis, patterns, psychology, and uncomfortable truths, everything comes down to one quiet but decisive question every man must eventually answer for himself: am I choosing love, or am I trying to earn peace? Because those two are not the same. Many men spend years believing that if they are patient enough, strong enough, understanding enough, they can finally create a relationship where conflict disappears and happiness settles in. They confuse endurance with virtue. They confuse self sacrifice with depth. And slowly, without realizing it, they trade their inner stability for the hope that one day things will feel calm. That day rarely comes. Not because love is impossible, but because happiness cannot be extracted from someone who hasn't learned how to carry it themselves. This is the part no one tells men early enough. Relationships don't create emotional health, they reveal it. Whatever is unresolved inside a person will eventually show up between two people. Love magnifies patterns, it does not erase them. That is why some relationships feel peaceful even during hardship, while others feel tense even during success. The difference is not money, effort, or romance. It is emotional responsibility. An unhappy woman is not unhappy because of one man, one mistake, or one missing gesture. She is unhappy because dissatisfaction has become familiar. It has become a lens through which she interprets reality. And until that lens is questioned, changed, and softened from the inside, no partner will ever be enough. This does not make her evil. It makes her human. But it does make one thing very clear: you cannot fix what you did not break. Men who finally understand this stop taking everything personally. They stop apologizing for existing. They stop negotiating their worth in conversations that have no finish line. They stop trying to prove goodness to someone who is committed to seeing lack. And something important happens when a man stops rescuing. He becomes grounded. Grounded men don't rush to explain themselves. They don't beg to be understood. They don't chase emotional approval. They listen carefully, speak clearly, and move deliberately. They respond instead of react. They stay open without being porous. They offer love without offering themselves up for erosion. This is not emotional coldness. This is emotional maturity. A grounded man understands that compassion without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. He understands that clarity is kinder than silent resentment. He understands that walking away from a destructive pattern is not abandonment, it is alignment. And here is the paradox most people miss. When a man stops trying to be everything, he becomes far more attractive. Not because he withholds love, but because he no longer gives it from fear. His presence has weight. His words have meaning. His boundaries communicate safety, not threat. Some women rise in response to this. They soften. They reflect. They grow. They realize that love does not require constant tension to stay alive. That peace is not neglect. That stability is not boredom. Others do not. And this is where discernment matters. Love is not about saving everyone. It is about choosing someone who is willing to meet you where responsibility lives. Someone who can feel deeply and reflect honestly. Someone who can say, "This is mine to work on," instead of, "This is yours to fix." No amount of chemistry can replace that. No shared history can compensate for its absence. No future fantasy can override present reality. Men who learn this lesson stop asking, "How do I keep her happy?" and start asking, "Is this relationship helping me become more grounded or more anxious?" That question alone protects years of life. Because the cost of staying in chronic dissatisfaction is not just emotional exhaustion, it is identity erosion. It is losing trust in your instincts. It is shrinking your needs to avoid conflict. It is confusing peace with silence. And no love is worth that price. Healthy relationships are not perfect. They have disagreements, misunderstandings, and hard seasons. But they also have repair. They have accountability. They have mutual effort. They have warmth without volatility. They feel like two adults standing side by side, not one person carrying the emotional weight of two. The men who thrive in love later in life are not the ones who tried hardest to please. They are the ones who learned when to pause, when to speak, when to stay, and when to walk away with dignity. They did not harden their hearts. They refined them. They learned that happiness is not something you give to someone else. It is something you protect within yourself and share with those who are capable of holding it. So, if there is one final truth to take from this entire discussion, let it be this: you are not responsible for another adult's emotional fulfillment. You are responsible for your own clarity, self respect, and standards. Choose relationships that meet you there. Because love should feel steady, not draining, challenging, not depleting, alive, not anxious. And the moment you stop trying to save someone from themselves is often the moment you finally save yourself. Now we move into the most practical and most misunderstood part of this entire discussion: communication. Not the soft, overused version that tells men to listen more or be more emotionally available, but the grounded kind that actually changes outcomes. Because the truth is, many men are listening constantly and still losing themselves in the process. The problem isn't silence. The problem is how conflict is framed and rewarded. In many unhappy dynamics, communication becomes a loop rather than a bridge. She expresses dissatisfaction. He explains, apologizes, or fixes. Temporary calm follows. Then dissatisfaction returns, often stronger. Over time, the man associates peace with compliance and tension with self-expression. He learns, quietly, that being honest costs him harmony. So he stops being honest. He becomes careful, polished, filtered. This is the moment intimacy begins to die, even if the relationship continues. Healthy communication is not about preventing conflict. It's about containing it. It's about slowing emotional momentum and bringing conversations back to reality instead of letting them spiral into global judgments like "you always" or "you never." Those phrases are not communication, they're emotional weapons. They erase context, effort, and complexity. And when tolerated, they poison connection. A grounded man does not argue facts against feelings. He does something far more effective: he redirects the frame. Instead of defending himself against exaggerations, he addresses the structure of the conversation. For example, "I want to understand what you're feeling, but I can't engage when everything is framed as a personal failure." This is not cold. It is stabilizing. It communicates willingness and self-respect at the same time. Most men avoid this because they fear escalation. But escalation is often inevitable when patterns are unhealthy. The question is not how to avoid discomfort, it's whether discomfort leads to clarity or collapse. Suppressed truth doesn't create peace. It creates resentment with a delay. Here is a critical psychological insight: emotions want acknowledgement, but behaviors need boundaries. You can validate feelings without validating destructive expression. Saying, "I see you're upset," is not the same as saying, "you're right to attack me." Confusing the two is how men get trapped into emotional submission while believing they're being compassionate. Another key mistake men make is over-explaining. They believe if they just articulate their intentions clearly enough, they'll be understood. But in emotionally charged moments, explanations often feel like dismissals. The more you explain, the more defensive you appear, even if you're not. Strong communication is often shorter, calmer, and slower. "I hear the frustration. I'm open to discussing this, but not in this tone." That pause, that boundary, changes everything. It forces the other person to either regulate or reveal. Someone committed to connection will adjust. Someone committed to control will escalate. Again, both outcomes provide clarity. Now, let's talk about a subtle but dangerous trap: performative empathy. This happens when a man mirrors emotions, apologizes reflexively, and reassures excessively, not because he agrees, but because he wants the tension to stop. Over time, this trains the relationship to revolve around emotional volatility. Calm gets ignored, drama gets rewarded. Eventually, the man feels invisible unless something is wrong. This is why some women unconsciously increase dissatisfaction over time. Not because they enjoy being unhappy, but because it's the only state that reliably generates engagement. Peace feels emotionally empty when it's never been associated with connection. Men who break this cycle learn to stay present without overperforming. They don't disappear, but they also don't chase. They remain emotionally available without surrendering their center. This balance is rare and deeply attractive. Another uncomfortable truth: some conversations are not meant to be solved. They're meant to be revealing. When the same issue appears again and again with different costumes, it's not a communication failure, it's a character mismatch or an unresolved internal struggle. No amount of phrasing can fix what awareness refuses to face. This is where men must stop negotiating with patterns and start observing them. Are complaints specific or global? Are requests clear or shifting? Is responsibility shared or outsourced? Does repair happen or is blame recycled? These questions matter more than chemistry, history, or hope. A grounded man understands that love does not mean absorbing emotional chaos. It means inviting growth and stepping back when growth is refused. This is not abandonment. It is discernment. One of the most powerful shifts a man can make is moving from reactive communication to intentional communication. Reactive communication is driven by fear: fear of losing her, fear of conflict, fear of being misunderstood. Intentional communication is driven by values, respect, clarity, honesty, and self respect. Instead of asking, "How do I calm this down?" the grounded man asks, "What kind of dynamic am I participating in right now?" That question alone changes behavior. And here's the part no one prepares men for. Sometimes, when you communicate clearly and set boundaries, the relationship doesn't improve, it ends. Not because you did something wrong, but because the relationship depended on imbalance to function. When imbalance disappears, so does the illusion. This is painful, but it is also merciful. Because staying in a dynamic where your peace is constantly traded for temporary calm slowly erodes your identity. You stop trusting your instincts. You question your worth. You confuse endurance with loyalty. And by the time you realize what's happening, years may have passed. Strong men learn this earlier. A relationship that requires you to abandon yourself is not love, it is negotiation under pressure. Healthy love allows both people to be seen. It allows disagreement without punishment. It allows space without threat. It allows growth without fear of replacement. These are not romantic fantasies, they are psychological necessities. In the next section, we will confront the final layer: decision making. How men know when to stay and build and when to leave with dignity. How to differentiate temporary struggle from chronic dysfunction. And how to walk away without anger, without bitterness, and without losing faith in love itself. Because the ultimate goal is not to avoid unhappy women. It is to become a man who no longer abandons himself trying to save someone else. Social media cannot be underestimated. It is not just entertainment. It is a mirror that never turns off. Every woman is quietly comparing her real life to everyone else's highlight reel: filtered vacations, curated smiles, perfect timing, perfect bodies, perfect love. What she doesn't see is the debt behind the photos, the arguments cropped out, the loneliness hiding behind the smiles. But the comparison still lands, and over time it creates a permanent feeling of not being enough. A quiet belief forms that life somehow cheated her, that everyone else received the good version while she was left with the unedited one. That feeling doesn't disappear. It settles in. And then self-sabotage begins. Here is what most men don't understand. One of the most uncomfortable psychological truths: many women are deeply insincere, not because they are bad people or wake up wanting to deceive, but because from childhood many were taught to wear masks. They learn to play roles, to become whatever version keeps love from leaving. They pretend to be easygoing, sexual, domestic, agreeable, not maliciously, but as a survival strategy. Performing becomes a habit, a script learned early, a costume worn daily. Then marriage happens, and the mask doesn't come off gently. It comes off explosively. They feel angry that they had to pretend, and angry at him for not seeing through the mask. What men often miss is that performing is exhausting. Exhaustion turns into resentment, and resentment hardens into chronic dissatisfaction. That dissatisfaction isn't always loud. Sometimes it sounds like sighs, sarcasm, or constant disappointment. At the same time, many modern women are fed a feminist superiority narrative, told they are queens, goddesses, prizes, and that men should feel lucky just to be chosen. But here is the paradox few dating experts explain. You cannot respect what you consider inferior, and you cannot be happy with someone you don't respect. That contradiction slowly eats away at connection, relentlessly and quietly. As a result, many women sabotage their own happiness, not intentionally, but automatically. They say they want stability and create chaos. They say they want peace and start fights. They say they want love and push it away. This isn't manipulation. It's unconscious programming. Dysfunction feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. For some women, dysfunction feels like home. Peace feels suspicious. Stability feels wrong. Happiness feels temporary, so they destroy it before it inevitably ends, because at least then they control the ending. Here is the darkest truth. One few love advice channels dare to say out loud. For many women, unhappiness has become an identity. They bond through complaining, gain attention through victimhood, and avoid responsibility through blame. They have been unhappy for so long they don't know who they would be if they were happy. That's why trying to help often backfires. You solve one problem and another appears. You meet one need and a new one replaces it. Because the unhappiness isn't about the problems, it's about the identity. The consequences for men are devastating. Good men spend years trying to fix what they didn't break. They lose confidence, lose themselves, and sacrifice their own happiness believing that if they just try harder, she will finally be happy. She won't. That is not cruelty. It is reality. The hardest truth, the one that either frees you or breaks you, is this: you cannot make an unhappy woman happy. If she was unhappy before you, she will be unhappy with you, and she will be unhappy after you. Her happiness is her responsibility. So don't chase symptoms, test patterns. Ask yourself whether she was happy before you, whether she takes responsibility for her emotions, whether she practices gratitude, and whether her expectations are realistic. If the answer is no, nothing you do will change the outcome. Understanding this won't magically fix relationships, but it will free you. Free you from trying to save what you didn't damage, from confusing effort with love, and from sacrificing your peace for someone else's identity. These are not just psychology insights. They are survival skills. Be honest, be grounded, and above all, never confuse responsibility with rescue. Now we arrive at the part most advice skips because it demands courage instead of comfort, responsibility, and boundaries. This is where patterns either finally break or repeat for another decade. One of the biggest mistakes men make is believing that endurance equals love. They stay calm while being criticized. They listen while being blamed. They apologize even when they don't understand what they did wrong. At first, this looks like maturity. Over time, it quietly becomes self-erasure. And here is the psychological truth few want to admit. When you tolerate chronic dissatisfaction without boundaries, you don't heal it, you train it. You teach the other person that unhappiness gets rewarded with attention, effort, and emotional labor. Human behavior follows reinforcement. What gets rewarded gets repeated. If every complaint leads to reassurance, explanations, gifts, or self-sacrifice, the complaining becomes more frequent. Not because she wants to hurt you, but because the dynamic now runs on that fuel. The relationship shifts from partnership to emotional management. You become a regulator of her mood instead of an equal participant in shared growth. This is where men must understand a difficult but liberating distinction. Empathy is not submission. You can care without collapsing. You can listen without agreeing. You can stay open without abandoning your center. Boundaries are not punishments. They are clarity. They tell the nervous system of the relationship what is acceptable and what is not. When a man calmly says, "I'm open to hearing what you need, but I won't engage with insults or global attacks," something important happens. The dynamic changes. Either the conversation becomes more grounded or the tension escalates. Both outcomes are informative. Growth oriented people adjust. Complaint oriented people resist. That resistance is data. Many men fear that boundaries will make them cold, distant, or unloving. In reality, boundaries are often the only thing that restores respect. When everything is tolerated, nothing is valued. When a man has no limits, his presence loses weight. Respect grows where self-respect is visible. Another hard truth: some women confuse emotional intensity with emotional intimacy. Raised in environments where love came mixed with anxiety, volatility, or inconsistency, calm can feel empty. Peace feels like neglect. So they unconsciously provoke conflict to feel connection. The argument becomes proof that the relationship is alive. This is not rational, but it is common. Men who understand this stop taking the bait. They don't withdraw or explode. They stay steady. They refuse to turn chaos into closeness. Over time, this either retrains the dynamic or reveals incompatibility. Both are wins, even if one feels painful at first. Let's talk about accountability, because this is where everything either matures or collapses. Healthy relationships require two adults who can say, "This feeling is mine to understand," before saying, "This is what I need from you." Unhealthy ones skip the first step and outsource emotional regulation entirely. The partner becomes the container for unresolved pain. No amount of love advice can fix that. No dating tips can compensate for someone who refuses self-reflection. Growth only happens when discomfort is faced, not avoided. If one person is doing all the introspection and the other is doing all the complaining, the relationship will slowly rot under the surface, even if it looks functional from the outside. Here is a grounded psychological marker men should watch for. Does she take responsibility after emotions pass? Anyone can be upset. Anyone can have a bad day. But when calm returns, does she reflect, repair, and own her part? Or does she rewrite history and double down on blame? Patterns reveal character far more accurately than promises. This is why strong men eventually stop asking, "How do I make her happy?" and start asking, "Is this dynamic healthy?" Happiness is not produced through pressure. It emerges from alignment, values, accountability, emotional maturity, and mutual respect. The goal is not dominance. The goal is balance. Two people who can self-soothe, self-reflect, and self-correct. Two people who choose each other, not out of fear, performance, or obligation, but out of grounded desire. When a man stops trying to rescue, something surprising often happens. Either the woman rises into her own responsibility, or the relationship exposes that it was built on imbalance from the start. That clarity, though uncomfortable, is freedom. Because the final truth is this: love should add to your life, not slowly drain it. Peace is not boring. Stability is not weakness. And walking away from a pattern that refuses to grow is not failure, it is self-respect in action. In the next section, we will go even deeper into the exact communication shifts that separate men who lose themselves from men who remain grounded, how to respond to criticism without defensiveness, how to invite clarity without escalation, and how to recognize when a conversation is no longer about understanding, but about control. If you've stayed with this message until now, it means something inside you already understands a truth many men spend years avoiding. Not because they are weak, but because they are loyal, hopeful, and willing to endure more than they should. This conversation was never meant to turn men against women. It was meant to turn men back toward themselves. Real love does not require you to disappear. It does not ask you to carry someone else's unresolved pain as proof of commitment. And it does not reward you for suffering in silence. The strongest relationships are not built on endless fixing, apologizing, or emotional negotiation. They are built on two people who are willing to take responsibility for their inner world before demanding changes from the outside one. If there's one thing to remember, it's this: patterns tell the truth louder than promises. Anyone can say they want peace. Anyone can say they want love. but watch what they practice. Watch how they handle discomfort. Watch whether they reflect or deflect. Growth is not loud, dramatic, or performative. It is quiet, consistent, and often uncomfortable. Many men stay too long because they believe leaving means failure. But walking away from a dynamic that refuses to grow is not weakness. It is wisdom. You are not quitting love, you are refusing dysfunction. And that distinction changes everything. A grounded man doesn't chase validation. He doesn't argue his worth. He doesn't beg for emotional safety. He chooses environments and relationships that allow him to remain himself. That is not arrogance. That is self-respect. And self-respect is the foundation of any love that lasts. If this message challenged you, sit with that discomfort. If it resonated, trust that feeling. Insight often arrives quietly, not as relief, but as recognition. You may see past relationships more clearly. You may understand why certain patterns repeated. You may realize that what you called love was sometimes fear dressed as loyalty. And that awareness, that clarity, is not meant to harden you. It's meant to free you. So here's a question worth leaving you with. Does the relationship you're in expand your peace or constantly test your endurance? Your answer matters more than any advice ever will. If you found value in this breakdown, if it gave you language for something you felt but never articulated, take a moment to like this video. It helps more men find conversations that don't shame them for wanting peace. Subscribe if you want more grounded psychology, relationship clarity, and real-world insight that protects your confidence instead of draining it. And most importantly, leave a comment. Share your experience. What patterns have you noticed? What lessons did it take you too long to learn? Your story might be exactly what another man needs to read to stop blaming himself for something that was never his to fix. This isn't about bitterness. It's about discernment. It's not about avoiding love. It's about choosing it wisely. Stay grounded. Protect your peace. And remember, love should feel like strength, not survival.